confidence is linked particularly to the action systems of the brain. It's a belief that you can do something, and if you do something, a certain reward will be, or outcome will happen. The main misunderstanding is confusing it with two things. One is optimism and the other is self-esteem. So optimism is the belief that things will turn out well in the end, and self-esteem is a self-evaluation, tends to induce great defensiveness and extreme behaviors to preserve that self-esteem. The human brain is plastic throughout life, even in late-stage Alzheimer's. Okay, the plasticity is greater earlier in life, plasticity becomes less, but the human brain is defined by plasticity, and plasticity is changeable by learning.
You have found the Thinking Mind podcast.
Welcome back to the Thinking Minds podcast. Today it's Alex, and we're in conversation with Professor Ian Robertson. Professor Robertson is a neuroscientist and psychologist and professor of psychology at Trinity College Dublin. He's also known as a leading researcher as to know how an individual may harness their attention system to enhance the mind's autonomy over emotions and thinking. He's the author of several books, including The Winner Effect, How Power Affects Your Brain, The Stress Test, How Pressure Can Make You Stronger and Sharper, and his newest book, How Confidence Works, The New Science of Self-Belief. In today's episode, we discuss the danger of overemphasizing the genetic influences on our psychology, how your environment can change your psychology, the ways in which a psychiatric view on mental health can be limited. We also discuss his book about confidence, the main components of confidence, the difference between confidence, optimism, and self-esteem, how you can become more confident in an area which you're not so confident in, and we talk about the obesity crisis, the opioid crisis, and much more. This is the Thinking Mind podcast, a podcast all about psychiatry, psychology, psychotherapy, and self-development. You may have noticed that we've increased the frequency of our episodes. That's because we want to spend more time focusing on the podcast, making it as good as it can be, and giving you the best possible content. So you can now expect a new episode every Tuesday and Friday. In exchange, we need your support. You can support the podcast by sharing with a friend, following on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen, giving us a rating, or if you want to support us even further, you can check out the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description. Thanks for listening, and enjoy today's show with Professor Ian Robertson. Thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you, Alex.
You've written a book about confidence, which came out in 2021, and you've written a number of other books about psychology. And it's really interesting to see how in your books you combine your knowledge of neuroscience, clinical psychology, but you package it in a way that's really useful for the everyday person. There's so much utility in it. What motivated you to write a book about confidence?
So I trained as a clinical psychologist at the Institute of Psychiatry a long time ago. And I trained, my first degree was in psychology. And at that time, there was this strange divide between the mind and the brain, and they were seen as two different domains. And I went to the Institute of Psychiatry and learned about behavioral therapy largely from Isaac Marx and Jack Rachman and Hans Isaac. Mm-hmm. But at the time, you were dealing with behavior and you were dealing with the mind, and then all my psychiatry colleagues were doing fascinating research, but it was all largely driven with the assumption that this was largely genetically determined or biologically determined. And there was this big divide between the two and very little crosstalk between the two. And I came away, if you had someone, I came away very pessimistic. I don't feel I trained. I was a particularly good clinical psychologist because I'd inhaled what I've now called the curse of genetic fatalism.
What's the curse of genetic fatalism?
It's the overestimation of genetic effects on behaviors in general, but abnormal behaviors in particular, in such a way that it disables people's confidence in their ability to engage in the necessary, painful, slow learning it requires to unlearn habits of thinking, emotions, or behavior. I'm not saying that it's always possible to unlearn these things. Sometimes it's not, but there is this. I just always remember in case conference and things, it was always the family history came first, and the genetics. It was just this implicit assumption. Of course, genetics was just coming into its own then, and my own fatalism about people's problems, the kind of pessimism that I inhaled I loved the Institute of Psychiatry, but I inhaled the pessimism that's inherent in the curse of genetic fatalism. And it made me a bad clinical psychologist because my lack of confidence in change obviously communicated itself to patients. And also I became frustrated that the clinical practice was becoming divorced from the science. There was no real connection. I found this later on I went to work in rehabilitation as well. And I remember asking one in neurorehabilitation, asking one of my colleagues, well, give me the textbook on the science of rehabilitation. And he gave me this book, and it was all about wheelchairs and occupational therapy. There was no science of rehabilitation. Right. There was no science underlying what the expenditure of billions worldwide was going on. And similarly for a lot of the psychiatry, the scientific and clinical psychology, the scientific rationale was kind of really lacking. So I got frustrated and after moved into academia and got my PhD late and moved to Cambridge and started working on the premise that, I was hugely influenced by a key paper by Mike Merzenich from UCSF, who showed that in adult animals, you get plasticity in the brain quite very late, as late as you like, neuroplasticity. And then Alvaro Pascual-Leone showed this in humans. And kind of genetic pessimists like Steven Pinker tried to say, that's just in the sensory motor areas that you get this plasticity. That's nonsense. You get it in all the areas of the brain. You get plasticity. And actually, the key genetic fact about the human brain is that we evolved for our brains to be plastically reorganizable by the environments we live in. I became inspired by that vision that actually, if you really apply the science of learning and try and understand the interaction of learning with the brain, you should be able to achieve improvements by proper experimental methods to try and tease apart these things. And I had some success in neurorehabilitation and doing that. Yeah. Now, more recently, I've been, we're trying to apply this globally in the Global Brain Health Institute, where we're trying to apply these principles to, in the absence of any properly effective treatments for dementia, and the fact that dementia, about 40% of cases are preventable by applying behavioral learning principles, lifestyle principles to people. Then we're trying to train fellows to apply this at a policy level. So and to escape the prison of believing all our behavior is predetermined by genes or very, very early experiences.
It's interesting. I've noticed the same divide you've mentioned between clinical psychiatry and psychology, and this notion of self-development, that you can improve your mental software, if you like, to improve your quality of life. Do you think it was merely an overinvestment in those genetic theories? Or do you think there was also a desire for the professions to distance themselves from what they saw as like pop psychology?
Psychiatry always tried to make itself more like medicine, and so given the huge advances in fields like cancer, amazing advances of molecular medicine, compared to virtually no advances in psychiatry at all, by applying, I think wrongly, this model to psychiatry. But the other thing is, medicine is hugely driven, enormously driven by the pharmaceutical industry. The whole agenda of medicine is or the medical device industry, and there's no industry for verbal protocols or learning. There's no industry there, so there's no funding. So it doesn't. So I think it's mainly commercial. is the reason that psychiatry has gone down that route, because there is an entire commercial infrastructure for delivering drugs.
I think that's definitely the case in the US. In the UK, from my experience, I think there's less of a hold that the commercial pharmaceutical industry has on doctors. But I do think our medical training really conditions us to see a very narrow range of treatments as legitimate. And those treatments are often pharmaceuticals. And I do think that is a problem.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I agree with you. The UK is more open, slightly more open than the US, which is just hugely driven, but in this way. But the problem is the cost of running even a phase 2 clinical trial for a verbal protocol is so great. It's very hard to build the evidence base for these things. It's happened with CBT to a certain extent, but so it's understandable. The curriculum is going to be focused on those domains where there's a strong evidence base. But I mean, the evidence base for pharmaceuticals and psychiatry is quite it's not clear cut, shall we say, as it would be in cancer. So but the fact is that it's very difficult and very expensive to do these kind of research trials. So I think psychiatry is a tough call, because you have to deal with these complex cases, many of whom do have biological origin, huge, strong biological contributors to them. But I don't feel that psychiatry training equips psychiatrists to deal with them, and also the sheer numbers at an average psychiatric clinic are so huge that what can you do except prescribe a drug or something? It's very, very very difficult to. So it's not that I'm just psychiatry bashing here. Definitely not. I'm just conveying that my own kind of journey has been now to try and train multidisciplinary fellows in policy relevant actions that are going to affect hopefully millions of people, whether it's about increasing literacy in South America to increase the connection of the hippocampus to the frontal lobes, or getting architects to get building regulations that cope with cognitive and sensory deficits. These are kind of examples of an environmental approach, which I think is going to be much more promising, but not exclusively. If we get the kind of equivalent of some of the cancer drugs for dementia, bring them on, fantastic, and I want them to come. But so far, tiny progress has been made. At least there's been a little bit of progress, but I'm not sure it's going to cut the mustard for that problem.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that I think psychiatric training is limited. I've noticed those limitations. I've noticed the impact of those limitations. And reading a lot of books about psychology is something I felt I've had to do to supplement my training, and has greatly improved my perspective and ability to interact with patients and clients in a more dynamic way. So getting onto the subject of confidence, what do you think most people misunderstand about confidence?
The main misunderstanding is confusing it with two things. One is optimism and the other is self-esteem. So optimism is the belief that things will turn out well in the end. And self-esteem is a self-evaluation, which tends to induce great defensiveness and extreme behaviors to preserve that self-esteem. Confidence, its secret sauce is a link to action. It's the fact that and confidence is linked particularly to the action systems of the brain. It's a belief that you can do something, and if you do something, a certain reward will be or outcome will happen. But it's domain specific. It's not a general, I am confident. You can have a very confident mathematician who's socially crippled and unconfident. You can have, so confidence is related to behaviors and success in behaviors. I think it's incredibly important in all clinical conditions. I think because it's not just confidence about action in the external world, it's also confidence about taking action in the internal world as well. And, we have the most complex entity in the known universe between our ears. We only have 20,000 genes coding. So these genes computationally cannot control all our behaviors, hence neuroplasticity and the interaction with the environment. And we have an incredible set of frontal lobes capable of orchestrating the action of this complex organ in its relationship to the organ. And that's the software of the mind, which I believe we have a vast enterprise ahead. People are going to have to become more expert at understanding that software and writing code for that software as needed in a rapidly changing environment.
How do you do that?
Well, just to give you one example, a very ancient psychological study showing that the psychophysiological symptoms of anger, this is the James Lang theory of emotion, anger, excitement, and anxiety have exactly the same psychophysiology. They only crystallize into a particular emotion by a context. In other words, a cognitive label. All this activation of the fight or flight system is simply an evolved preparation for action. And that action could be running away, it could be fighting, it could be celebrating. It only becomes a particular emotion by the interpretation of the cognitive interpretation of it.
So we might normally feel anxious about something, but what we're doing is applying a concept of anxiety to the same feeling, which we could equally label as excitement, happiness, or anger.
Yeah, and Alison Brooks at the Wharton School in Pittsburgh showed a few years ago, got people to do the Trier stress test, which is giving a presentation, a very stressful situation. You have to do mental arithmetic in front of a critical audience, and your heart rate is shown on the screens in front of you. And she got them to go up and do this, and they were told every time they made a mistake. Well, there were three groups. I'll just mention two of the groups. One group had to say beforehand, as they saw their heart beating, they had to say, I feel excited. Sorry, I feel anxious, which was correct. But the other group had to just, with the same input, had to say, I feel excited. And just that one word change resulted in better performance in the group who labeled these symptoms as excitement. So it's just that sense of control. We know that socioeconomic status is a huge determinant of psychological and psychiatric morbidity. If you're poor and if you feel poor,
which is a relative thing, if you feel poor relative to others or rich relative to others,
or if you see how high or low you see yourself in a subjective status scale, social status scale, predicts the dopamine receptors in your ventral striatum. Okay, and the higher the lower the number of receptors, the more likely you are to be depressed, to be anxious, to have low motivation and initiative. This is a socio-psychological variable imprinting itself in the molecular biology of the brain. But that seems very pessimistic, because across the world we know that your perceived social status will hugely influence your lifespan, your physical morbidity, your psychological morbidity, your quality of life, your depression. However, there's one variable that more or less gets rid of that relationship, and that is people who have a sense of control. People feel that they have some control over their life. And one of the biggest senses of control is to feel that you have a sense of control over your own mental space, over the contents of your own mind, that you don't feel just vulnerable to external biological forces like anxiety, that I have anxiety, as if it was a fever.
That's a huge problem nowadays. That's how we talk about it. That's how it's enmeshed itself in this culture.
Yeah, and that's because we have a medicalized culture. And that's the curse of genetic fatalism, because it's eroding that potential sense of control. If people had it, would mitigate a lot of the negative effects of social environment on their mental and physical state.
So a big lesson to be learned here I guess one of the things people aren't apprehending is that our psychology is dynamic. We often think of people as that's a confident person, that's not a confident person. But what you're saying is an unconfident person can learn to become confident.
Oh, absolutely. Confidence is a set of habits, habits of attention, habits of action, habits of handling anxiety. And one particularly important habit is your habits of theorizing about yourself. So Carol Dweck, the great Stanford psychologist, made this distinction between, it's a very important one. I know it's been taken up in business a lot, but there's a core truth to it. If you are stricken with the curse of genetic fatalism, either for good or bad, I mean, if you're a kid that's been told she's really bright, saying that kind of thing to a kid cements a fixed theory of their brightness. It doesn't matter whether you think you've got a low IQ or a high IQ. If you think it's something fixed, genetically determined, it makes it brittle. And the evidence is you fail that test in school, or you don't do it, you go into a big school where there's lots of smarter people than you. The reaction can be catastrophic, and you say, oh, maybe I'm not bright. And all your mental activities go to protecting your self-esteem, protecting this image of yourself, and you don't encode new information, so you don't learn from your mistakes nearly as well as ones with and that's the problem of this whole business of labeling and medicalization of normal ranges of normal behavior.
And I think people tend to think in very static terms anyway, for some reason. I'm not sure why this would be, because one of the things that makes humans humans is we're so dynamic. We can adapt ourselves to so many situations. So in a weird way, it's like we're being robbed of our birthright, our evolutionary heritage as creatures that can put ourselves in new situations and figure it out, which is the essence of confidence, I guess.
I wonder sometimes whether it's kind of Protestantism, the Puritan ethic that has affected Western society, particularly via America. The notion, and in Protestantism, you were either one of the elect or you were not. There was no route to salvation through good works, and this strange paradox that was it Becker, the philosopher, pointed to. He said the Protestants are constantly trying to prove that they belong to the group that's going to be saved. So there's this, but so there is a kind of this idea of you're a good person, either you're a good person or a bad person, and this kind of fixed theorizing about people. I think it's certainly strong in our culture. That may have nothing to do with it, but certainly, I worked many years ago in alcohol problems, and in industries that sell profitable drugs, whether it's alcohol, tobacco, or gambling. There's a huge need for them to ascribe the problem to internal biological factors in the individuals.
They're prone to addiction, or they're an addict.
This is the classic defense. No, you're an alcoholic. Once an alcoholic, you have it in you. And they hate the idea of not just the idea, the truth, that basically alcoholics are made by drinking a lot, and drinking a lot is influenced by how expensive and available and advertised the alcohol is. And the same is true for gambling, and the same is true for smoking.
I mean, I was talking about gambling with an evolutionary psychiatrist, Dr. Randolph Nesse, and there are very good reasons why we're prone to being addicted to gambling. In fact, it's so deep in mammalian circuits that you can get a mouse addicted to gambling.
Yeah. Well, I mean, getting a reward activates the same circuits that cocaine does.
Yeah.
And the gambling and the gaming industry have studied learning theory, psychological learning theory. They know precisely what reinforcement schedules are going to result best in the strongly habitually learned behavior. But it's the environment. It's not, yes, there are some people have, if you like, basic propensities that maybe make them more vulnerable to it. That's for sure. The alcohol industry and the tobacco industry I'm sure in time the cannabis industry they will all they will all say that oh no, the problem is ours is a safe drug. It's just we have some people who are biologically predetermined to they need to be treated by doctors.
The Sackler family used that defense as well. They said that the people who got addicted to OxyContin had problems where they were drug addicts. And there's a subtle implication of a moral failure.
Exactly. That's right. Yet the most common person, or the most common single category of person who ended up hopelessly addicted was people who'd been for orthopedic, middle-aged people who'd been for orthopedic surgery, and who were, because medicine had been systematically corrupted, the guidelines about pain prescriptions had been systematically corrupted, including that they were prescribed absurd levels of these things that previously would only have been given to terminal cancer patients.
And I think food and obesity is another good example where often food companies would like to say, well, you should eat a balanced diet and exercise and you should be able to stave off obesity. And really, it's a discipline issue. But if it were a discipline issue, 2/3 of people wouldn't be affected by being overweight or obese.
Yeah, exactly. And there are there are people who are advocating very strongly, eminent people, for a genetic theory of obesity, and saying the only treatment for obesity is drugs, and there's nothing you can treat. And the trouble with that approach is it's manna for the people, for the producers who are able to use these arguments to resist regulation.
And I think it's a shame because it's not like the discussion of genetics doesn't have a valuable place in all of these issues. But it's a shame that we tend to see things so black and white, that bringing genetics into the discussion needs to obviate common sense, environmental measures.
Yeah, I mean, this idea that it's okay that there are these small genetic lineages that just have eat and get very, very fat, and that seems to be a hugely genetically, strongly genetically determined. It runs in families, and of course you get that. But for most behaviors away from these are for instance, appetite is hugely conditionable. Hugely conditionable.
Yeah. And of course, if you have hyperpalatable foods, they're going to stimulate your appetite. So getting back to confidence, could you take us through how you break it down in your book and what steps people can take to become more confident in a particular area of their lives?
Sure. So confidence is, as I said, has two elements to it. It's can do and can happen. I believe I can do something, and if I do it, the outcome will happen. This comes from the great psychologist Bandura, who talked about efficacy expectations and outcome expectations. And that gives you 4 states of the mind and brain. Can't do, can't happen. Can do, can happen. And then you've got 2 others. You've got can do, can't happen. And then you've got can't do, can happen. And that gives you 4 states. Top left, apathy. We know that people who are apathetic, perhaps because of learned helplessness, etc., have lower number of dopamine receptors and PET scanning, less likely to feel they can take the initiative, lower mood, higher anxiety, etc. Bottom right, confidence. If you believe you can do something and you will get the outcome, the reward you want, your brain treats that as if you have achieved the reward. So you get a little anticipatory increase in dopamine, which acts in 4 ways. It acts as a natural mini antidepressant, a natural mini anti-anxiety drug. It makes you more likely to take action. because we know that anxiety tends to reduce all sorts of activities in anxious people. And fourthly, it makes you a little bit smarter because of the dopamine innervating the frontal lobes. That means you're more likely to do the thing and to do it well and to get the success. Not certain, because confidence is about bridging uncertainty. Okay, you say I can do this, or as Melissa Mayer, the first woman head of Yahoo, said, success is about doing things before you feel quite ready, and that's what confidence does. It allows you to do things before you feel quite ready. But confidence is exponential. It works like compound interest. Because if you do that one thing, you're more likely to do another, and that then multiplies. And that's what we see over lifetimes. That's what we see in kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, equally bright, two little girls. One of them has slightly more confidence than the other. That increased confidence will mean she's more likely to try the new thing, to ask the question, and that then multiplies compound interest. And then by the time they're in a clinic at 40 and 50, you're getting huge yawning differences in achievement, which people then, my experience of psychiatry was people try to link that back to genetics. And yes, of course, genetics endows you with propensities. But basically, they're all, because we've only 20,000 genes, they are fairly broad propensities that are hugely malleable. And so you may have a slight edge. A boy may have more testosterone and therefore more surgency in the old terms, and therefore be more likely to take that step than a girl. But it all depends on what the response of the environment is, whether that gets amplified or not. The genetic propensities are not deterministic at all. It all depends on what the interactions are.
Or I mean, maybe you could say the genetic propensities become more deterministic if you let them become more deterministic by falling into this trap by thinking that things are static. Like genetics are lowest common denominator.
Yeah. So genetic heritability is highest when environmental variability is lowest. That's why the Scandinavian twin studies all grossly overestimated heritability of psychological factors. And when the equivalent twin studies were done in southern states of the USA with enormously environmental variability, in one IQ study, the heritability dropped to 0.
Wow. I was talking about this idea with Robert Plomin, who is a geneticist, and we were talking about how body weight is hugely heritable, like 70% heritable, but it's that heritable if you don't exert any control over your food environment. So
if you have an environment that has little variability to it, where it's saturated with fast foods, if you're living in Los Angeles where there's no decent food for 100 miles, then you have a very uniform environment,
right?
Where the heritability will be much greater. But if you have a highly varied environment, the heritability is going to drop hugely, and that's what people like Plomin don't, just grossly overestimate this genetic story on behavior.
Well, Plomin, to be fair, when I talk to him, does acknowledge this huge pliability because of environment. So he doesn't want people to take away the idea that genetics are this very deterministic prison.
Well, I've seen a lot of public, whether some of he's changed his view, but certainly that wasn't what I picked up from his earlier, from years ago from him. He was very much a strong advocate, but maybe he's changed his views.
It might be interesting for you guys to have a conversation and see what agreements and disparities you have.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's fair to say that if someone's not confident about something, let's say they're not confident about losing weight, they either don't think they can take steps to change their diet or exercise, say, or they think if they take those steps, it won't work.
That's right. So, I mean, one of the reasons that people are referring to in the obesity world, saying the only way we can deal with this is through drugs. One of the reasons there's a support of that argument is psychological treatments for obesity have, like psychological treatments for other addictions, have failed. But it's not just obesity; it's failed for alcohol problems, for drug problems, and that's because the learning is so strong. The conditioning is so strong, and appetite, like sexual behavior, is so hugely conditionable. And it may be that we we have to use drug, and I welcome if we can get effective drugs for specific aspects of these. So I'm not anti-drug at all. But the problem is it's in the whole domain. You've got the tip of the iceberg of these highly obese or highly addicted people, where it's very difficult to break these highly established behaviors. But there's millions of other people who are on the way who if they only didn't hang their hat on this kind of fatalistic notion about the behavior would have more of a sense of control. And if you have a sense of control, you'd be more likely to do it. And I do believe there's some evidence for Weight Watchers programs. I don't think it's entirely bleak, but it's much, as with all things, it's much easier. The earlier you can get a disorder, the easier it is to change it, because there's a less pernicious learning history there to undo.
I think what most people get wrong about weight loss is they see it as a temporary problem with a temporary solution. So I'm fat now, I need to go on a temporary diet, fix that problem, and then I'm done. Whereas I've come to realize is if you have a vulnerability to being overweight, weight management is just something you need to incorporate into your life forever. And that includes eating healthily and exercising. Yeah,
absolutely. But people who pour a lot of scorn into what they see as that kind of ineffective soft way, I mean, I agree with you. But I think and I don't know much about obesity, but there is a degree of addiction to the certain fatty and sugary foods.
Yeah,
it's not all about calorific intake and the appetite system of the brain. I think that because I've discovered some nice genes there, leptin, etc. People generally don't just eat mashed potatoes and apples.
Absolutely not. No, there's definitely a problem with the quality of the food that's being consumed.
It's the sugar, and it's the salt, and it's the mouthful, and all of these things. And then of course you have this terrible low self-esteem problem in people who are overweight, and of course low self-esteem, while not being the same as confidence, if you have low self-esteem, it detracts from your confidence. And so there becomes a self-rule. Well, I'm fat, and it becomes kind of self-fulfilling prophecy in that way, a kind of fatalism about that. So I don't want to pretend it's all just hand us over to psychologists, we'll sort obesity. Absolutely not.
Right.
But the whole focus on appetite alone I think has been problematic because of things we've just been talking about.
So what if someone's not feeling confident about their situation? What are the steps they can begin to take to remedy that?
If I can give an example from my own, after I did my PhD late, and I gave my first outing of my research to a conference, and in the front row of the conference there was a distinguished Oxford professor there who I knew. And she was shaking her head and looking bleak when I was talking. And I was I couldn't keep my eyes off her. And I was just stumbling over my words. And I just felt my academic career was dead before it was finished. I just felt absolutely awful. It was only afterwards I realized and then corrected. We know from experimental research that anxiety and threat will make the selective attention system become super threat focused. So it will scan for further evidence of threat. So when you start to be anxious, your attention homes into that one frowning face, and you keep and then because you're paying so much attention, it appears bigger and more frownier. We know that attention increases the perceived size of objects, for instance, and it then multiplies, and you become more anxious, and it's a vicious cycle. If I had only known then that I could control my confidence by choosing to pay attention to the majority of either moderately interested or neutral faces, I would have not fed that vicious cycle. So that's one example. Your emotional, the state of the contents of your consciousness are almost exclusively determined by attention, what you pay attention to, either in the external world or the internal world. Attention, you can learn to control your attention, and to the extent that you can feel in control of your attention, you will be more confident. The second thing is action. Rumi, the Afghanistani poet, or Persian, or several countries claim him, 13th century. He said the path only appears with the first step, and that's such a profound statement, because I said confidence about bridging uncertainty into the future. And bridging uncertainty requires sometimes doing things without precisely knowing if the thing you want will happen, or even sometimes what will happen. But it's just going forward will put you in a position where you have a different perspective, maybe different encounters, different thoughts. Okay, but the problem with anxiety is the predominant problem among mental problems, really. Problem with anxiety is, across the cultures, it makes you withdraw and avoid, because it's threat perception. So you don't do stuff socially, career-wise, physically. So you're then cut off from the Rumi benefits, if you like. So that's why taking action, confidence, is learning to do the thing in spite of the anxiety.
Yes.
And if that helps, that then takes me to the third day, is dealing with anxiety. You have to have a model of anxiety that's accurate, not inaccurate, that is not this biological thing that attacks you, because if you see it like that, you'll run away from it, and it will chase you even more. If you see it as, with a slight decentered approach, as, oh, here's my body's psychophysiological response, that's interesting. It's even maybe I can jujitsu that to seeing this as can I do this in spite of this feeling? And the evidence is that confidence will be boosted to the extent that you do it in spite of adversity, in spite of anxiety. So that's just, so action, attention, anxiety, attitudes to self, the self versus, shaking yourself out of the curse of genetic fatalism, whether it's about your intelligence, your abilities, your emotions, or your personality, is just escaping the illusion that this is all pre-programmed and unchangeable. The human brain is plastic throughout life, even in late-stage Alzheimer's. Okay, the plasticity is greater earlier in life, plasticity becomes less, but the human brain is defined by plasticity, and plasticity is changeable by learning.
All those 3 points have so much profundity in them. I found them all personally helpful, even before I found them explicitly articulated. And I find the problem with a lot of self-development literature is they might focus on one and exclude the others. So some emphasize massive action and hustling and getting things done. Some talk only about like brainwashing yourself for success, like manifesting and The Secret. And some talk about going into your body and reframing anxiety, but don't mention action or the other aspects. It's really interesting.
I mean, some lovely UCL research suggested that even a simple habit takes about 60 or 70 repetitions of the behavior in a conscious way before it becomes a habit. So you imagine some emotional, cognitive, some thought or some behavior or some emotion that has become conditioned either to something in the external world or to something in your internal world. And that is maybe that link has probably been forged a million times in your lifetime. And you want to change that. That takes huge amount of effort and learning, and that demands a sense of control, of confidence, of belief in the learning model, and not it means you have to discard the belief that everything is predetermined by your genetics or some biological factors over which you have no control. And of course, in some cases, the learning is so strong that it's to all intents and purposes, it is like a biological factor over which you have no control. I don't deny that. I worked in alcohol problems for many years, and people who are severely addicted, I didn't see any successful way of treating them. So hence I moved into the prevention, people who were drinking too much, but not yet at the addictive level. And there we did get significant effects. It's possible to do that. So, yeah, I'm not a Pollyanna about the application of psychology to severe behavioral problems. The appetitive disorders are just hugely problematic, and they probably will need a combination of biological and behavioral methods,
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it remains true that people need to, on some level, come to want to change themselves and believe that they can and take that first step. It's very difficult because like you said, selective attention is a very important factor, and you can present someone with all the best information in the world, and if they're not ready to receive it, they won't take action on it.
That's right. And then people do form concepts of themselves that imprison them as well. One of the big things about my experience of working with addicts, and I suspect this applies maybe to elements of the obesity world as well, is you have a reward system that has been so force-fed, so to speak, that it starts to function abnormally. But basically, there's one reinforcer that can give you the slightest bit of lift out of the grayness. And every other reinforcer has normal, healthy reinforcers, conversations, games of football, watching sport, all they become grey in comparison to the single reinforcer. And so there's this ghastly prison you're in where the world looks grey and bleak without the reinforcer. And that's the, and then of course, that's why one reason why the suicide rate is so incredibly high among addicts, I presume,
Because I guess one of the things that defines addiction is the narrowing of repertoire from which you think you can get rewards.
Yeah, I mean, if you lose your job, but you've got a balanced life, you'll still get reinforcers from your family or your friends or your hobbies or your sports. But if you lose your addiction, all of these natural reinforcers have lost any power they have to give your impaired reward system a little spike of dopamine activity,
And one of the other things that people don't consider when it comes to both success and failure is the importance of repetition, as we've discussed. Success is not going from a 0 to a 1. It's an iterative process, an iterative creative process. You get a hypothesis, you try it out, it doesn't work out, you try again, until you start to get some traction. But failure also works with repetition, as in having a downward spiral in your life it requires an iterative, repetitive process of things going wrong, and then those problems compounding each other.
Yeah, I remember I wrote a book you mentioned, The Winner Effect, which is a fundamental biological phenomenon where success breeds success. And people often used to ask me, is there a loser effect? And it hasn't been explicitly demonstrated like that, but there probably is.
Can you take us through the winner effect briefly?
Sure. So the winner, a brief story. It was a 1951 University of Chicago, a mathematical biologist who had, I think, escaped Germany or Eastern Europe during the war. He was trying to understand how hierarchies develop in species, having witnessed the awful hierarchy of the Nazis. And so he created models where he put in things like weight, testosterone levels, size of group, all the kind of variables you might think of, and then looked at whether you got stable dominance hierarchies arising. And he could get hierarchies, but they weren't stable. They constantly were changing. And he published the first paper just saying, I'm defeated in this effort to understand how you get these hierarchies. And then he had a brainwave, and he put in one little rule into the equation. And that rule was, if you had a competitive encounter with another member of the group, and you won that encounter, that slightly, tiny bit increased your probability of winning the next encounter. When you brought in that rule, you got stable hierarchies developing. This was predicted mathematically in 1951. It was not demonstrated in any species until 1967 in the green sunfish. And it wasn't demonstrated in humans and tennis players till about 2003. So that's the winner effect, and it's been shown in it's related to the home field advantage. Where you see in sports that playing in your own home turf, you get an increased chances of winning. Part of that is you get more testosterone generated in your home turf. But there was a very interesting study with mice in the States, and showing that when the home field advantage, when they had a win, when they won an encounter, a fight with another mouse or a standoff with another mouse, they actually increased the number of receptors for critical aggression hormones like testosterone, and so that it wasn't that made them chronically aggressive. It was just they had more receptors there, so the next time there was a competitive encounter, the testosterone and other hormones released had a much bigger effect because there were more receptors. And so you get more aggression and more motivation in the combat. And so there's very likely, success after success has biological effects in the brain, whereas failure after failure, well, we know some nice, very good research been done in Oxford on people with chronic unemployment, is that kind of sense of, if you have that sense of defeat and loss, if you like, or in life, that you get, actually, you can visualize that in the brain, in ventral striatum, dopamine receptors. They're using PET scanning, and that's been shown in New York as well in its relationship to perceived social status.
Wow. Do you find learning about this stuff has been helpful in your own life? Because this is like the metaphysics of how psychology works, and the practical applicability is so huge to these ideas.
Yeah, I do actually, because I'm not a spring chicken, and in 2012 I went on sabbatical to Columbia University in New York, and it wasn't specifically the research I was doing there. Yeah, it informed me, but it was the interaction with other New Yorkers. In America, there's this idea of the 65 retirement age doesn't exist, so people don't feel themselves bumping up against that ceiling, and they don't titrate their lives according to that. So that's partly because there's a terrible pension system and all that, but it was liberating. And it made me realize, and there's lots of research on aging. I mean, confidence in aging is just a huge thing in terms of self-fulfilling prophecies. I could go in chapter and verse on that with you, but so yes, in my own life, I was sitting in a cafe in New York having a coffee, and I overheard this conversation to an older man, a younger man. He was thinking of changing job, and the younger man was maybe 35, 40. And the older man was saying, "Look, you've got 50 years of active, of life. You've got 50 years of professional life ahead of you." And that's how people think and thought, and it's hugely liberating, because you escape from the horrible fatalistic notions that go with, as if there's a biological predeterminism of aging. Of course, there are propensities and there are losses, but by God, there's a huge amount to play for, given the plasticity of the brain.
Yeah, a huge amount of flexibility. Well, Professor Robertson, I'm conscious of time, but thanks for spending some time with me today. Your books have been immensely interesting, and I'll put links in the description. And we'll be glad to have you back on the program at some point in the future.
Okay, be delighted, and I hope you can send me a link to the podcast when it comes
Perfect. Thanks so much for listening this week. If you've got any feedback, as always, do get in touch. If you enjoyed the episode, why not give us a rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, because it really helps other people to find us. If you want to get in touch, you can find us on Instagram or Twitter, or you can drop us an email. And if you value the show more generally, why not buy us a coffee just to help keep us going? Thanks so much.